Hopefully in the top right, it should say that we're live. Say that. It takes a while.
Yeah, top left.
Look at that. The height of professionalism on our channel. Right. Okay, so I'm live. I'm currently with Zandrus, someone who's a bit right-wing, but I found in my online conversations, thought we should chat more in person than a little text scroller. And Zandrus said yes. So Zandrus, how are you today?
I'm very good. I just got home. And I'll just change the avatar real quick. I'll just find something. And like for those who know me, like I've sent this link to a Discord server who's a center left Canadian YouTuber. I have it's on the Discord channel right now, so there might be audience coming from that.
That's all right. More the merrier.
And yeah, they'll be familiar with the profile picture, and you will be too, because it's this one I use on Discord. Instead of the OBS logo, we'll just put this one on instead. Oh, it's not working. Do you use what's it called? Oh, dang it. How do I move? Okay. Yeah, I'm using a browser right now, which is LibreWolf. I'm not using Chrome, and it's giving it has this thing for the HTMLs because it's for all the data and whatnot. So I had to turn that off. Let me see if it's gonna. Nah, it's not working. No, we'll just continue like this then.
That's okay. Right. Well, if you get it working later, then we'll see.
Yeah.
But yeah, a little chat about, we were talking earlier, and well, the last few days, I suppose, on Republicans and sort of the way American politics is. So I think it would be a good place to start there. You're the guest. You're free to start us off. What are your, given what we were sort of talking about earlier, do you want to give a brief overview of what we were sort of saying and then launch from where you'd like to start?
Basically, what I do see a lot on the media is like on both sides, basically, but then there's like this whole Fox News bit right here. But the controversy is there's a lot of partisanship, a lot of corporate partisanship that is made to tailor to people's sensibilities rather than give accurate information, which is a big issue, which I've seen a lot. Like I have to find something good, because since these big companies always for example, they throttle the algorithm with certain words or certain catchphrases. Like they'll put something in bold letters and they always appear on the front page.
Like clickbait, you mean? Like clickbait.
Yeah, clickbait. Like to work the algorithm, And those will usually reach the top because one, they're corporate sponsors. And those will have ads on, for example, they will have ads on Google. They use Google ads and they put more money into marketing and whatnot. Meanwhile, the ones with more context, I'd say they converge the evidence from all the articles and make a clearer picture. Those are much more independent, more or less, but they're obviously much lower down on the search result list, if you can get my drift, unless you manage to screw up the algorithm a little bit and you'll see it appear more often.
Yeah, you got to tailor. Yeah, like you got to tailor your internet usage to get yourself into a better sort of place. I agree. I think that the way that news has been commodified, as with everything else, basically, into whoever gets the most clicks is best, put out just whatever you can, flashy headline, encouraging sort of a less informed public consensus. And I think that this is something that should be unanimously able to be said as, yes, this is a bad thing. But I guess, and it sort of comes into what we were talking about earlier a little bit, I think it's important to look at the system that has cultivated this. Because you're quite right, we should have independent news, separate from corporate interests and political parties, that says, yes, here is a presentation of the information you need. Here is a critical analysis of this information. But because we live in a world of capitalist markets where people not only exist with their own moneyed interests, but are part of wider corporate structures, it's hard for that to be realized. Like if you are a news network and you are funded with private sponsors, those private sponsors have market interests. And so the people paying you directly to exist as a news outlet have an interest in what is reported. So if you, say, are receiving money from a company like Amazon, your coverage on labor rights or strikes or the minimum wage is going to be affected by how Amazon perceive it at that time. Would you agree?
I think regarding with Amazon, because here in the States, this is what I see. is Amazon is very much in favor of for example, they're in favor of minimum wage. It's true that they're also against unionization, because that's a lot of the news. You see a lot of the news about unions in Amazon. It's the first thing that comes up. They're like always anti-union, but but in Congress, when you look at their money flows, they always push for minimum wages. And it's for two reasons. One, because they're automizing their workforce, basically. They're using less workers and they're making it more productive using, drones or robotic arms, robotic delivery, logistics units, for example, for articles, whatever articles they'll be selling in that warehouse, for example, instead of forklifts operated by an operator who is OSHA certified, et cetera, et cetera. And with minimum wages, with advocating for minimum wage legislation, what they do is slash out the few competitors that they do have, which are very few. They'll just push them out of the market entirely.
Yeah.
And that will have them keep the monopoly of that sector of the market, which is shipping and whatnot. Yeah. And on top of that, and obviously it will cut out some people from work because they're already automizing. Are you going to pay a robot to do the work? No, it's you're outsourcing it in a way, but it's in-house. And the few workers that do stay do get that wage, but the cost remains relatively similar in a way. I mean, like if you don't sell a product, you still have to pay the guy anyway. But you get what I mean?
Yeah, no, exactly. Like you're quite right. Amazon, massive entity. I was reading the other day about how much of the domestic grocery market it's conquered, how much like just of food production it's bought up and got control over. It's huge, and you're quite right. They can afford to support the minimum wage and therefore undercut tons of businesses and control even more assets and such. But I think it's important to remember that firstly, minimum wage is not a living wage. Like the minimum wage isn't enough for many people to live on. As currently existing in the US. And
it'll depend on which location. For example, it'll depend on your material conditions. For example, if you have if you live in some place with a American minimum wage, but in a country that's significantly cheaper to live in, at least in the American context, that's basically more than enough, for example. Or it depends on which state, for example. Like each state has its own tax rates, it has its own property rates, it has its own. And it's very contextual. There's the federal rate, which is flat across the board. From what I know, it's $7.92, if I remember correctly. But they'll
$7.25, I thought. $7.25, I thought. But yeah, it's somewhere in that range, right?
Yeah, I think so.
But then that speaks to firstly, that you're quite right. It's relative, but on the whole, minimum wage isn't enough to be able to afford rent, food, electricity, transportation. Like the other costs of society aren't covered adequately by the mandatory stuff that it's not as though the corporations have, out of the goodness of their heart, said yes, we'll pay minimum wage. They've had to have that imposed on them because previously they were they were happy to take even more profit from the labor of said workers. And so when we think about Amazon and this power they exert, whilst they, of course, are engaging with many social things and are happy to, say, yes, we pay minimum wage, we'll do this and that in the community.
Like on top of that, they'll even advocate for raising it too, like raising it to $10 or $12. They'll lobby for those same goals in government.
Well, I must admit, I've not seen Jeff Bezos, come out and say things like that.
Well, it's more like you can see if you like. There's these lobby trackers in the U.S. There's those websites dedicated to tracking which lobby. Like for example, if you want to see what Amazon lobbies for, you'll see it. I think it's called Open Secrets, but I think that's more for politicians. Like you'll see Nancy Pelosi's who lobbies for her, or Bernie Sanders who lobbies for him, and you'll see how much money, which PAC it is, which super PAC it is, how much money, in which time frame. It's very, very specific. But for Amazon, I haven't found a site for that yet, or maybe there is, but just lists it as an entity rather than just a little tab which you can see which politicians they sponsored and at which rate, which one's more, if they favor more Democrats, if they favor Republicans. And
of course. Though Jeff Bezos, of course, he put his weight quite strongly behind the Republican Party, and he put it to the last election. It's worth pointing out, of course, as well, that a minimum wage increase can be justified to the sort of corporate capitalist structure if it's paired with deregulation, gutting the environmental protections, the sort of right-wing economic outlook that the Republican Party, the decrease in tax for major corporations. These things can then be used to market the supposed minimum wage increase, because it will, allow Amazon to make more money and maintain the supply of workers that are then, forced to go to them to have access to things that previously
also
denied.
The fact that, like, historically speaking, I'm sorry for interrupting, but historically speaking, even back to the 1910s, when you had these large monopolies of, for example, large natural monopolies, when the government did antitrust laws, they did not impede the same person, the same CEO, to actually own majority shares in those fractured corporations. Once again, it's what happened with Standard Oil back in when the first antitrust law came out. They just had the only thing they lost was basically having the single entity. Now they just had multiple subsidiaries under their majority share control, in which, like, there's like a news article, like a bunch of union articles who went against that law because they knew what was going to happen. They knew that antitrust laws were not going to work in their favor. It was just going to be, it was going to fire workers on a massive scale, because you're just separating everyone from one entity. They get fired from one entity. There's a confusion with the bureaucracy, the paperwork, the taxation, because it's no longer a monopoly anymore. It's not a huge oil monopoly. Now it's a subsidiaries of much smaller sizes. And it was a big mess. Like, for unions, from what I saw, the newspapers at that time, it was a big mess. And they did not want it at all. And the government went ahead and did it. And like they said, they just went hands up, like, oh, it's done. We did a good thing. They basically washed their hands like Pontius Pilate. And they just went on their way.
I mean, I think it speaks to that, the problems with our sort of current societal organization, right? Like was there a bit of an echo there? Oh, no, it's not. Never mind. Right. There's that. Every act that is passed, every attempt to try and improve societal organization is mediated through economic structures and markets and the pools of existing entities that wish to maintain their societal power. So what starts out as potentially a really strong piece of legislation has to be watered down and adopted and resculpted, and the final product may not be what is idealized. So to say that, of course, there's going to be some people who would not like the implementation of it, but I think the importance of regulation on corporate America and the capitalist economy on the whole can't be understated. Like, without it, we'd have a situation. You think about the wealth of capitalists in, I don't know, pre FDR America, basically. So the big 1920s, where you have these massive tycoons buying up so much property, so much land, making a killing, and then crashing the economy. Like, the Great Depression speaks to what happens when we allow this sort of open paradise right-wing capitalist dream.
Well, there needs a bit more context, where there's a book on it. I mean, it's a right-wing offer, but he gives the other context of the story. He uses primary sources. When I recommend it to give an idea of what it looks like, the context of the Great Depression is basically it's after the First World War. Europe is a destroyed economy in all sense of the word. There's war reparations, war debts, people who are unemployed on a massive scale it's more like faithfully is in an economic sense, soldiers are not employed persons. They do not produce consumer goods at all. Neither does the war economy. They do not produce consumer goods. Those are war goods. They are meant for war. They are meant for destruction, and they don't stimulate the economy. They're built for destroying the enemy's economy and the workforce, and obviously their frontline manpower, the reserves, and of course propaganda, agitation. So what you have is Europe is destroyed. the treaties of Versailles, which was basically everyone knows the quotation from General Fuck, right? He said this was a treaty for 20 years. This wasn't a treaty. This was like a non-aggression pact for 20 years. But he didn't say that in the context that it was too harsh on the Germans. He said that in the context that it was way too relaxed of a treaty. For example, because what happened was, Lord Maynard Keynes, I mean, he's the biggest British economist. He's very influential. What he did was listening to Ludendorff, like the German economists from the former German Empire, was, oh, the Versailles Treaty is making us feel like we're responsible, too much of an economic burden. They need to give us some leeway. And so Maynard Keynes, being in connection with these economists who were, going against the Versailles Treaty, the initial drafts of the Versailles Treaty, he went ahead and said, you guys should chill out with the very high war reparations you put on Germany and give them a blank check of war reparations with changing minimums and whatnot. And the problem with that was it went ahead, but the thing is, when Germany started to pay its war reparations, they were borrowing money. And when they were borrowing money, they were buying it, like, for example, if they paid 2 million Reichsmarks in war reparations, they would borrow 4 million abroad. And where were they borrowing that from? They were borrowing it from the New York Reserve Bank. They were getting loans from abroad, from the United States of America, just as every other European country. Like Great Britain had a lot of loans from the United States. Obviously, it's because the United States economy being so far away from the war, it came out strong because, frankly, the war did not touch their front. It wasn't bombed. It wasn't, having revolts in any colonial.
It had the industrial power to benefit, as you say.
And it had a lot, and it didn't depend on export economies. Like, I don't know how much it was in exports that Britain took. I mean, it has its natural farmland, but I think it would, for example, from India, it had a lot of grain and tea, and it was a big cost to transport all of it. But considering the United States being so huge, like it's basically Europe in size, and they have all that farmland in Arkansas, Kansas, Texas, Idaho, Minnesota, the Rust Belt, Alabama, Georgia, Florida with its own agriculture, sugarcane, mango. It was basically its own autarky in the literal, in the sense of produce. And they came out strong. And they had the money that was actually not depreciated from the war, while the other governments were just pumping out money for, paying off the debts or paying the cost of, like, getting these rifles from Lee Enfield, or Schneider cannons from the Schneider Artillery Company, or Mauser for Germany, on top of war reparations. It became a mess. Everyone was just making more money, putting more money in circulation. It lost value, depreciated, and it was a mess. And, like, on top of that, the United States was borrowing money abroad, and they were basically giving it to people who would pay part of the loan less than before. And it was going to it became a disaster, basically. And the first people that went to support FDR, they were not, like what usually history says, but like this is from Wall Street corporate letters. Like, you'll find them in the National Archives and everything. You have Wall Street lobbying for FDR's campaign because FDR was one of them. He was one of the people of Wall Street. He was working at Wall Street for a while. I forgot the details, but he was very much involved in Wall Street, in the financial district. And
I don't think anyone's ever said the Democrat Party are red socialists or anything. So there's no.
Well, no, I'm not saying for red socialists. Like, you do have factions that are red, but then there's that whole other history of the Wall Street that they did fund Lenin. There is a lot of stuff, like, for example, Trotsky in New York. Like, I'm serious. Like, Trotsky, when he was in New York, his own family, I think it was his daughter in her diaries, she said, in New York, we had a limousine, a penthouse, and a maid. And my dad did not pay for anything. That's from her own word. I think that was his daughter. But yeah, It was
let's rewind slightly. Not to say that none of that was interesting, because you have a very nice voice for it. I was listening in, but let's rewind slightly. The Great Depression, you're right, has many factors that contribute to it. It's not as though someone pressed one button and suddenly everything fell apart. But mixed into the central themes of it are the laissez-faire politics that America and other nations adopted, the deregulation that came with laissez-faire politics, that essentially allowed those with capital to spend and lend and act however they liked, with very minimal regulation and restriction. And then the cumulative effect of endless, as you say, printing of money, seeking endless gains and profits, and then realizing that this isn't sustainable, and the ensuing economic crash. And so when we're thinking of the context to which many of these decisions have happened, the reason that that if there is that regulation in place now, and the reason that a lot of our existing social structures that aren't quite left, but certainly have been attempts to make fair the capitalist structure that we have had for centuries now, have come from the context of the right-wing model of the purely laissez-faire, let the market do as pleased, falling apart. And the Great Depression, you can argue quite strongly, was one of the main contributing factors to fascism, the horrors of World War II, and the greatest, the worst period of devastation that humanity has. Probably most people, if you point to a conflict, most people will say, World War II, that's the nadir of human interaction. And so I think that is sort of the environment we have to take into consideration when we're talking about the things in place in society today. Like, for whatever flaws we have in sort of, I guess you could call it, social democracy of sorts, which we sort of see to varying degrees. We have a capitalist system like as a sort of overarching thing, but it looks different ways in different countries because of how varied their social democratic structures are. So I'm in the UK. I'm a British person. We have I'm not going to say socialist systems in place, but we have like healthcare that is universal. You go to hospital and
the NHS.
Exactly, the NHS. You have the right to be treated. Most countries in the developed world, and most in general, have education, that is universal. Kids have a right to education, and they go and it's expected they'll be taught and such. These are left-wing interventions upon the capitalist structure, and that isn't to say that I'm not going to sit here and say yes, every single left-wing intervention as implemented right now is perfect and great. But the reasons that they struggle is not because of the intervention itself, but because of the overall structure that it's had to interact with to gain it. Like, let's say you are a politician in 1930s America and you're trying to clear up the mess of the Great Depression. You're trying to improve society to fix the mass unemployment and the homelessness and the loss of land. And at the same time as you're doing this, you're confronted with a political structure that is basically bought and dominated by massive tycoons, the Rockefellers, your Andrew Mellons,
Carnegie.
Exactly, right? Like these huge, wealthy entities in society. Of course, there's going to be a strain. Of course, there's going to be struggle. It's like anything. To use a sports analogy, we're talking about it off stream. If you're like a club that wants to try and do well, and you've been promoted to a Premier League, and like the opposition has spent billions for years in a row beforehand to assemble like the best team, of course you're going to struggle. And so we apply this analogy to the political world, and those who want to make change within the capitalist structure that we have a huge task in doing so, because there's already massive moneyed interest. And so Amazon, to sort of link us back to what we were saying early on in the conversation, a company like Amazon can afford to pull a few strings and say in some places, we're happy to put our weight behind, increasing minimum wage, because at the same time as doing that, they can also say, well, let's bin off some regulations. Let's make it so we don't have to pay tax again this year, and have some loopholes so that we can put our factories wherever we like. And of course, they'll be happy, paying a few more dollars, to each worker, because they're now basically a $1 trillion company and no one can touch them. They've actively funded and bought the politicians writing the laws in the Republican Party and in the, not that less right-wing Democrat Party to be able to do so. So I think it's so important to analyze the system around a party and around the decision to see why things happen, and why like right-wing economic structures have influenced the way our entities interact with the world.
Well, regarding this is my part of the story. I don't know if I could say my part of the story, as it is my opinion, but I come from a more right-wing, laissez-faire part of the wing, and I'll admit there was some parts of history where there's some things that pretty much there was a mess. I think at least in Italy, 1920, 1922, the first years of the fascist regime, you had a lot of liberals, laissez-faire liberals, industrialists supporting fascism, but not because it was already industrialized as they wanted to reap profits, but because in the conditions of Italy, it was a agrarian society like the Soviet Union. It was basically the material context of the Soviet Union. It needed an industrial base. It had a few in the 1890s, but it was simply like, considering the population, the boom of the population post-war and influenza and all that, they needed a large competing market. They wanted a large competing market because they were basically treated on the world stage like, oh, it's a tourist nation. Oh, we can just go there and eat pasta, go on the beach, and that's it. Forget about it. There's nothing to invest here, just tourism. And industrialists, what they had with Mussolini was he was going to industrialize the country, and they were in favor of that. And basically in every other instance of any industrializing, modernizing regime, they're going to put their backs behind it if it means it's going to help them go ahead. And industrialization as a further one is going to bring a lot of investment into the country.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you bring up Italy, and sort of that links, I suppose, to that Great Depression sort of topic we're talking about. Fascism, was a new interpretation of politics. Certainly, you look at Mussolini and Hitler, and how they took over Weimar Republic into Nazi Germany, Italy into fascist Italy. But we also still need to look at the economic and cultural and political context that produced them. And one of the core tenets of their fascist movement, and of fascism in general, was the allegiance they made with existing capitalist structures. There were, as you've mentioned, the Soviet Union, there were many in Europe who looked east and thought, wow, if we don't sort out the sort of power imbalance, not power imbalance, the angry working class, the angry reaction to basically a massive global economic crash, we might risk what happened in the Soviet Union, where the wealthy capitalist class and many of the ruling party were overthrown. And so because of that, fascists emerge who say, yes, we're going to not only protect the capitalist interest and the interest of business, but we're going to make it so that you are all, you have the freedom to do as you wish. We're going to crush the workers, the unions. We're going to put the socialists in prison or kill them. We're going to not only do that, but play on existing societal bigotries to enforce, the sort of racialized, hierarchized divisions of society even more. And that's where your Hitlers and Mussolinis come in, who say, yes, we're the true Italians, we're the ethnic German quality. We are the people in society who should be on top, and we're going to represent you and such. And then when we get in power, hand resources. The term privatization was popularized through the economic policies of these countries. That you look at all the German companies which got their start in Nazi Germany, and it's staggering how many there are actually. BMW, Audi, Alpen, like
Volkswagen.
Yeah, exactly. Like so many corporations directly benefited from the policies of Nazi Germany. And that's not to say that like all these companies now are active Nazi fronts, but what it does say, Fanta Stonebutt has said in the chat, hello by the way, I've said him hi in the chat, that's one of my viewers, friend of the channel as well. But it's staggering that we can see the economic link so clearly today, and yet it's not like the fact that the economic factors that produce so much of the capitalist wealth today have benefited directly from a fascist country. I think is an important thing to reflect on, and of course as well the fact that in these countries the forced the forced work expectations placed on workers, you're going to go and work, otherwise you have failed the country and you're a traitor to the nation, and therefore subject to imprisonment and all the horrors of the concentration camps and such. That is part of it too, like as well as the obvious racial elements and the anti-Semitism and all the horrors of the Holocaust and such. There's also the fact that the labor that the Nazis and other fascist countries, Italy, Croatia, Slovenia, like all the nations that colluded with the Nazis and such, they created through their imprisonment and their far right policies a huge pool of labor to produce goods. And I think that is an ugly truth of the capitalist system, that if it's left to its own devices and it's not strictly monitored, then you've got this risk of the worst people interpreting capitalism in a way that allows them to dehumanize people and then put them in camps and then make a killing off the profits and such.
Well, here comes my part of the aisle. Well, at least what I have, I have a book I've translated in Spanish. I'm looking forward to having an English edition of it, which is called explicitly The End of Capitalism. And the context of this book, the man's name is Ferdinand Fried. Who is Ferdinand Fried? He is part of the movement called the Conservative Revolution, in quotes. And he was part of the newspaper Die Tat, today, I think. Die Tat, yeah. And he was usually considered in considering his collusion with the, for example, the Strasserist Black Front. I don't know if you have heard of the Strasserist Black Front or the Strasser wing of the National Socialist Party.
Yeah, the Nazis who believed in more, less right-wing economic visions. They were sort of more like they wanted the left ideas to be of more.
I can go deep into them if you want, or I can just give you an example. I can continue on with the man in the book. And
go for what you're saying. So you choose where you
go. Well, context. Strasserism. What is Strasserism? Usually, people when they go online, they go on Wikipedia, they'd say it's a left-wing form of National Socialism, because Strasser, he always liked to make face like, oh, the socialists left the National Socialist Party, and he said, oh, I'm going to bring everyone over to my side. And the historical context was basically he just didn't like Hitler's insistence on keeping the nation combined, class collaboration. Like, there's always been a class collaboration, there is, but it was more out of political expedience rather than, say, outright loyalty to capital, like usual narratives. It was out of political expediency, like what Lenin did in the Soviet Union with his capital forces, or Bela Kun in Hungary, who, despite expropriating the property of the landlords, since nobody knew how to organize the property of said landlords, what happened? Bela Kun came and he said, and the aristocrats came to Bela Kun. He said, we can do this for you, but if you give us our land back. And he's like, okay, I'm going to make each one of you a commissar. And that's what happened. Bela Kun is noted as the Hungarian Lenin, but it's pretty funny that none of those guys ever became communists or card-carrying party members, but they were given the same property rights back, and that's a whole nother story. That's why he was so unpopular among the peasants, because he basically gave the land back to the aristocracy. But back to Strasser. His views are significantly different from Hitler's in the political sense. What Hitler is a centralizing partisan vanguardist. And I don't know if you know what is partisan vanguard. I don't know if your audience knows, or do you want me to explain what partisan vanguardism is?
You can go, Zandrus. You can go.
Partisan vanguardism is the theory that a vanguard party, which is a party of intellectuals, people who know how to agitate and bring people to a revolution, because the working class can't make a spontaneous revolution like what Marx predicted in the Manifesto and Das Kapital, or Anti-Düring, the German ideology, etc., all those works. It was a reaction because when they saw that the revolutions were failing because they had no leadership, that was where mass psychology comes in, the ideas of Benedetto Croce, or maybe, I think Freud was involved, but I think it was more about the famous mass psychology theories. And everyone knows partisan vanguardism because it was Lenin who used it to a very successful extent. It was him using the Bolshevik Party, which is, I think it was called the Majority Party in Russian. I forgot the story. The Mensheviks, the Bolsheviks, but the Bolsheviks were more about partisan vanguardism, a party of very intelligent people who are built leaders with their own hierarchy, who lead the working class to a revolution, doesn't let them, let it die out and fizzle out due to the lack of organization. And that is what Hitler did. He organized people to a degree. He made the hierarchy of the party as the arbiter of him and, of course, the cult of personality. Without a partisan vanguard, you don't have personality cults. And he also destroyed the federal system that the Weimar system had. He basically made sure that there was no parliaments in Bavaria, there was no parliaments in Prussia. It was just a synchronization of the entire state under one national body. What is Strasser in comparison? I'm not sure if you're familiar with the HRE, but in a way, it's like a federal system instead. It is not a centralized system, but rather a federal one. And he was in favor of no cults of personalities. He was in favor of a federal system. People could vote in it, like through the corporate chambers. And that's the other part. The difference is not the economics, as some people say, because Strasser and Hitler's mentor, in a way, are both Werner Sombart and Rudolf Jung. Rudolf Jung is one of the first, is what people consider the Karl Marx of National Socialism. He was the guy who posited the theory, and of course, Gottfried Feder. And they basically took from him Hitler's first early works. Like if you looked at early Hitler, you see he was more corporatist at the start. And that's what Otto Strasser came out to be. He was more corporatist rather than, say, a working class socialist. Because if you read his works like Germany Tomorrow, he always mentions corporate chambers, the guilds, the state, employer federations, the existence of managers, and the class collaboration. That is basically Strasserism in a nutshell. Hitler, meanwhile, believed in a more, at least when he became much like at the later stages of life, Hitler was much more inspired by Stalin and Lenin, which, believe it or not, is the most hilarious thing, but it is true, because he believed in the blurring of class lines. He believed that the workers should have more social mobility upward, but without the middle class or the bourgeoisie.
He said some of this stuff. What he did, I think, is more.
Yeah, there's also what he did too.
Important, but that's for as much as as all this theory and things that have been said on paper. I think with fascism, action speaks louder. And we mentioned Strasser and Ernest Röhm and people like who, as you say, who had more left-wing economic and sort of organizational ideas, and perhaps didn't maybe want the sort of Führer as almighty leader and such. And they were all killed in the Night of the Long Knives. They were, the Nazi Party gutted itself of the previous, the SA for the SS. It removed any dissidents from the fascist plan that Hitler and the very right-wing Nazi Party had. And once they were gone, they then had the tools to
there's also the other victims.
Zandrus, if I just say a little bit more, you can come in a second, but just let me respond just to a bit of what you said then. And I think that this is the sort of central point, because of course there's lots of words that have been written from various National Socialist figures and stuff, and many of them will have contradictory ideas to what has happened and what other people in the party have said. But that's sort of the point. The fascist movement isn't one that's built on like a central pillar of logic, and those who tried to make it more of a structured thing were killed off. And that's because ultimately fascism is a reaction of the capitalist system. And for as much as Hitler may have said a lot of stuff to try and win over working class voters, I think it's important to stress, it's not as though Hitler's charisma won the German people. Like, he had to kill, imprison, or disenfranchise many, many people for the Nazis to actually win their election and then get into power. But what he says is different to what is done, which is the case in a lot of politics. But crucial action. Sorry.
Yeah, but I can also talk about. That's why I'm going to connect. Here's the what do you call praxis, and there's a lot of connection between his words, what he said, and there's a lot of the stuff he did in government. For example, Long Knives, where he purged the SA. He also purged the SS as well.
Yeah.
At least one member of the SS was purged, but he also purged the right wingers of the party. And there was another purge yet again during the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. I think it was 1939. It was reported in the Jewish Telegraph Agency that all the anti-Bolshevik members were thrown in prison for being anti-Soviet Union, for vocally being against the Soviet Union during the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And that was more pragmatic, you can argue. But there's also, again, back to Long Knives. He, for example, with the staff of Fritz von Papen, who was the Reich foreign minister, he was outside of the country at the time. What he did with his staff members, he was a right winger. Fritz von Papen was a right winger. What happened to the entire staff when the SS or the Gestapo went into that building? They shot everyone dead. They shot his secretary. They shot his other staff members. There was also 2 Wehrmacht generals also killed that night, which the common narrative is that he was pro-Wehrmacht, he was pro-aristocracy, but he was like, but to send a message to the Wehrmacht that he wasn't their plaything, is that he had 2 of them killed off, Kurt von Schleicher, and I think the other one's name was von Treskenau. I know it wasn't, both were aristocrats, von Schleicher and von Treskenau. I might be wrong on von Treskenau's name, but I know there was Kurt von Schleicher, I'm very sure, because he was ordered to be killed, and he was one of the right-wingers during the last chancellorships. And regarding the praxis of the regime, for example, and this is going to sound very surprising for you, but under Hitler's regime, Hitler outright advocated for women to cheat on their partners and to have other lovers. And when he found out a woman in Hanover was arrested for not identifying her lover, he went out like with a rage and he demanded that she get released, and she was released immediately on his behalf. And there was also the decriminalization of the law of midwives involved in those pregnancies. Like, for example, if a woman was pregnant with another man's child, the midwife could not go to court to testify who was the lover. That was decriminalized, and that basically kept the secrecy of the lover behind, of course, in the context, of course, of the Nuremberg race laws. But it was more pragmatic with the ideology to create, more children. But there's also the leeway that it had with, at least in one aspect, the rights of women to have more than one lover, and destroying the old system of marriage. Like he was out there like wanting and wishing for destruction of the old marriage system.
Well, yes. I mean, I think fascism, it's important to say, as I said earlier, it's an incoherent and senseless and mindlessly violent system. And so I think the fact that they can be, because women's rights weren't, it's not as though women were like liberated in Nazi Germany. Like they were expected to be the producers of the Aryan master race, weren't they? Like they're expected to produce, like each woman is. I think they actively had reward systems for, women who mothered many children. Because
they were given medals. There's also like the investment into humanities, and you had a lot of female students too in the university sectors, at least for the humanities and arts, because Hitler was a big he was big on the arts and the humanities.
Well, yes, so they loved their idea of just Nazism.
Racial
racial science.
Idealism, yeah.
Yeah, they believe they were the Ubermenschen.
And for me, what people don't get is that, although it's very common, but like it is if you like read the literature, you look at their economics, what they did in practice, what they did in law, it is a very consistent logic behind it. If you like, for example, for more reading, you can like take Zeev Sternhall, Fascism in France, Neither Left or Right, or James A. Greger, The Faces of Janus. or God's Alley, Rainer Zeidelman, even some left-wing books too, like Mihai Vaja of the Budapest School. He's a Marxist, and he outright says that fascism is a historically progressive movement because the working class, like for example the strikes, everyone knows about Biene Rosso. What he said was, due to the fact that the workers were striking and the farm workers usually were striking, they were limiting the productive capacity to mature in Italy. And he still says it's a bourgeois movement. But he says it's historically progressive in the context of Italy. And that's what he said, not me. That's what he said.
Well, everyone's entitled to their opinion. But rewinding a second, so we'll go back to women's rights very briefly. The fact that they simultaneously had very traditional expectations of a woman being in the house and, mothering as many kids as they can and being the producers of the ideal Aryan race and such. And then also would sometimes, have surprisingly lax views on, where the kids came from and such. But that contradiction is found all across fascism, because ultimately it's about grabbing power and getting to the top of a hierarchy and doing whatever you can to maintain it. Hence the collusion with capital to make as much money as possible very quickly, because they don't care where it comes from as such. They just want it to happen and don't care who they trample over to get to it. And so that brings us to the Night of the Long Knives. You're quite right. Plenty of people who would be described as right-wing and would even have many similar views to Hitler were killed off as well. And that's because, as well as being inconsistent outside itself, it's also a hateful, competitive, argumentative and toxic environment to be in. If you're a person that has said, yes, I am the Führer, I am supreme, we're going to be at the top. Of course, you then have an issue with other people in the same movement who are also charismatic, in the sense of being able to speak to a crowd and captivate people. And Hitler is just one person. The Führer, could be anyone, right? Like, if for as much as it is Hitler, there's also plenty of people who would have seen themselves as being competent and able to speak. And perhaps even, Hitler famously wasn't exactly the model Aryan person, was he? He wasn't a blue-eyed, blonde-haired German.
Well, he was
German,
blue-eyed.
right?
He did have blue eyes, but he was black-haired. That's where you're right. He did have blue eyes, but he did have black hair. People usually see that he's brown-eyed because of the actors who played him in movies, and that's where the generalization comes from. But many people who knew him said he had blue eyes. Sometimes they say he had even violet eyes under certain lighting conditions. But yeah, he had blue eyes. The actors in the movies, like Bruno Ganz. Yeah?
My mistake when I said if I got his eye color wrong. Yeah. But the point I'm making, right? Like, he's not. He's hardly the vision of Übermensch that was cast. And that you can imagine that if Hitler, is viewing the party as a whole, there's a lot of people with a lot of power, generals especially, who have direct access to the militant force that is also central to fascist control. So Night of the Long Knives comes around, and as well as people who strayed from the right-wing path, there's also a culling of rivals and of people that would have been well placed to potentially leverage the Nazi party for more resources, like army generals and such. And so we also then turn to the supposedly contradictory allegiance with the USSR. Like, as you said, Hitler was for many years friendly with Stalin. Well, no, not friendly, but colluded with Stalin. Their actions.
He even during the war with Stalin, he was like, why are you calling Stalin a criminal? He was doing stuff for the Bolshevik movement. He was robbing banks not for his own gain, but for the creation of the revolutionary movement. Like back when he was stealing money from banks in Georgia, I think, and getting more funds for the Bolshevik party, for example.
Their actions in Poland and such, absolutely. But I think that if we think about it, there's not really hypocrisy as such here with what we're saying. Stalin was also an authoritarian. While Stalin was part of the Soviet, the idea, obviously, they called themselves communists because, of course, like in the same way that the National Socialists called themselves socialists whilst jailing socialists, the Soviet Union and Stalin called itself communist whilst having already killed off, the communists in the revolution. And
that started. I know I can add in a little bit, but like that started not with Stalin, but with Lenin in a way, like what he did with the Mensheviks. And what
we'll come on to that. If I just finish what I was saying, but just very quickly. The fact that authoritarian leaders like, you know, bond together isn't too surprising when you think about it, because they have an interest in maintaining power structures. So for as much as the Nazis campaigned and said openly, yes, we're going to protect you from the threat of communism, they're happy to side with, you know, powerful people in Russia if it means they're going to, you know, set their interests. And of course, as with all fascist movements, eventually Hitler, you know, decided to take the Nazis into Russia, and arguably this was the, you know, turning point, because trying to battle off, you know, trying to make the way through the Soviet Union and then also the Western Front as well, you know, was too much for Nazi Germany. But ultimately, authoritarian leaders say anything and do anything if it means maintaining their power. And so you're going to see lots of contradictions within Nazi policy there. What were you going to say about Lenin, though? Sorry, I stopped you there briefly.
With Lenin, it basically, you know, everyone knows about the Soviets. I don't know if anyone knows about the Soviets, but they're like, in the more explicit tone, they mean the councils of soldiers, workers, and peasants. And they, before Lenin, they were independent inside the Russian Federative Republic. They had secret ballots and whatnot. They had of all parties, Mensheviks, Left SR, Bolsheviks, and even some more right-wing parties, Social Democrats, or even liberals. But then when Lenin came around, after losing the 1918 election, I don't know which month it was, but he did lose an election, and he lost very bad. And when the Soviets, under his part of the country during the Russian Civil War, Lenin decided to centralize all of the Soviets under his control. He put restrictions on their, for example, he put restrictions on who would be allowed in it. Like, he banned certain parties from being in the Soviets, and made sure there was like a different voting threshold, or to obviously favor the Bolshevik party inside the Soviets. And there's even cases of even Bolsheviks going against this and rebelling against Lenin's authority. Obviously, they would be decimated in their efforts, because obviously if Lenin won, he came out on top. And then he would invade Poland and attempt to help the Red Finns, but that also failed with the victory of the White Finns and the establishment of the Republic of Finland, etc. And even after that, like 2 years after that, between those 2 years, it's still like the last years of his regime, there was the creation of the first ever Russian Eugenics Society. That was unheard of in Russia, but he created the Russian Eugenics Society, and it was basically the more positive eugenics, quote unquote. That wasn't more, but it was still for, like, you know, studying races, all that stuff, all that all that stuff.
Did
back
Lenin? Now, most of that sounded. I'm not sure I've actually come across the Lenin eugenics stuff. However, there's, I mean, whether or not Lenin's personally tied to that, I don't think is the case. But there's absolutely nationalism. I think that's definitely an important point to say, that nationalism isn't unique to, you know, fascism. Right. Exactly right. Nationalism, because whilst the nation as a construct is heavily linked to projects of wealth and power, and that ties into capitalism, you're quite right. The nation and nationalist sentiment can be found from many pockets of politics. And I think that is the important thing, one of the important factors to consider when discussing Soviet Russia. So the fact that because I think there's definitely a tendency to be very all or nothing with the Soviet Union. People like either say yes, you know, the Red Scare is coming, we must completely, you know, everything about it was atrocious, or go the other way and say yes, glory to the Soviets. And, you know, you see those like pictures of like Lenin, Stalin and such, and like they're all like faces like side on, Chairman Mao and such, and that's silly as well. But I think, again, history is important. You imagine you're a revolutionary in 1917 and you've overthrown this abysmal, like the Tsarist system was atrocious. Russia was, you know, it took so long to catch up to the other European powers. Many of its, like, the literacy was rampant, starvation, all this stuff. It was terrible to live in Tsarist Russia for many, many years. And it only started catching up with very, you know, important left-wing interventions pre-revolution. Revolution happens, the peasants and such, they revolt. Absolutely, you know, there's good justification for it, right? Because they needed change. However, because there's a difference in, you know, the vision of the communists and such is for global class warfare. You know, the whole the proletariat of the workers of the world, right? Everyone's got a role. And so the vision is that Russia does it, and then the next country, and the next country, and then the whole working world can come together. But this doesn't happen. It's confined to Russia.
Socialism in one country.
Exactly, right? And when you have a power structure that is not only still using many of the same structures as the previous system, but also engaging in a capitalist world that's actively hostile to what's gone on there, there's a problem. You can't engage with things in the same sort of vision that the initial communism system would have. And so when you have an election where people vote against the Bolsheviks, when you have dissident parties and factions within the nation, when you have a nationalist element too, because let's not forget, they, as you've said, they are still Russian, they still engage with the world, however much many of them want to move on from nations to differing degrees, they are still engaging with things as Russians versus other. And Russia's not a small country, right? Like Russia is made up of many, many different ethnicities and groups.
Yeah.
Right. This then leads to the sort of decisions that you see where Lenin is acting in a way that you would more identify with a dictator rather than a sort of communist ideologue. That then engenders elements of his party, where we find Stalin, where we find other authoritarians who gain more power. See many of the sort of more traditional left-wing ideologues in the party imprisoned or killed. When Lenin falls ill and atrocities have happened, because let's not forget that there were atrocities that the Soviet Union committed. We now have Stalin, who is absolutely 100 times worse than Lenin, now in power and ready to just become the dictator. And it's not really until after the war we see more after World War II, we see even attempts to go closer to the original vision. And that's even then, it's still a country, it's still one state, it's not the communist vision that wasn't idealized. But all of this is to say that authoritarianism is going to find power is going to corrupt in many different societies. But I would call myself a socialist. I wouldn't ever sort of say, yes, I want the Soviet system. But I think the problem there lies with the way that power and systems, as again we said at the start, has an impact on everything. We all interact with many different facets of the world at once. And so to try and be one person or one group and say, yes, we're going to do things our way and this will work, is going to inevitably need compromise. And if that compromise is managed poorly, risk can happen. Bad things can happen.
Yeah. I don't know where to take it from here, but I'm more about history. I always like giving people history, make people think what, your gestures you were making, what the hell is this? I never heard of this before. I want to do that with people and have them learn, because it's always worth learning a lot of stuff, especially if it's stuff that people even history in a way became commodified. It's always definitely. These books. Books are usually about these catchy headlines, the same catchy narratives, Hitler's mechanized army. But then you read Glance and it's a line infantry army. That's why they lost so much in the Soviet Union. They were fighting line infantry with line infantry. And the Western armies, in comparison, are motorized or mechanized divisions going through North Africa, going through Europe, because they have force multiplication. And of course, obviously, the material supremacy in both quality and quantity. You have the Germans doing mass mobilizations. And it's pretty telling that at the same time as Germany was scraping the barrel, as you say, with manpower in 1945, even with the Soviets, they were scraping the manpower barrel. In 1945, they were doing these offensives that were placed at certain places. The whole, it's 10-1 advantage against the Germans. The Germans were always better because we killed 1 million of them in one spot. No, even in other parts of the front, you don't even see any Soviet soldiers. You have German units in defensive lines waiting for Soviet advances, and when there's an offensive, there's just nothing there. They just don't see anyone manning positions, and sometimes even went further and they said, this position's empty. It was a very bloody conflict. And the whole thing about the mechanization of Hitler's army, it's honestly it's a propaganda by the regime itself. You have, I think it was more horses and even trucks or tanks in the German army from beginning to end. They had more horses than anything.
Well,
and it's like,
exactly,
oh,
right?
it's a
Like,
super modern army with its and then they make these these dumbass memes, they had UFOs and supersonic fighter jets. Like, it's so silly.
well, exactly as he said, it's the regime doing work for itself, because of course they want to say, yes, we are the masters of military combat and we will crush you with our tanks and such. Part of the thing of fascism. I reckon I've actually changed the title. We're going to have to talk about Republicans and such, probably in another stream, because we've more spoken about the history of it. It's actually been quite a quite a bit of more consensus than I was expecting on a lot of the stuff. Actually, I feel like we're you're very you've got a lot of interesting history stuff to say. I think what we do with that historical, with our sort of historical knowledge is important.
And give the context to everything that's happening now. That is basically what we're trying to do.
Well, exactly, right? Like, it's the worries that many have about fascism today, myself included, can be linked to our predecessors. The crisis of the economy, the mad dash to power you see of many, the sort of cults of personality, the sensationalism and the propaganda, and the fact that we have seen, well, I say we're not old enough to have lived through World War II or anything like that, but as a human species, we've seen many of these things happen before. And it's why there needs to be this connection made between past and present. We need to be able to say the mistakes made within capitalist economies in the past produced fascist societies then, and if we're not careful, and it's sort of already happening to some degree, there's the same things are happening again, because we've still got many of the same structures in place, and that's why it's so important, I think. And we'll have a bit more time in this one, but my laptop, I'm just touching it now, and it's very it's not really doing as well in this heat, so we may head to a conclusion fairly soon, and potentially do a part 2 if you're interested.
Definitely.
More about the present.
Basically, the end point, at least for me, as a little amateur historian, but I like to give everyone my sources. I would love to give you all the sources, all the names. I have over 100 sources stored on my USB drive, and
I'm exactly the same. I've got a folder of my academic papers and stuff. Just
I think the first book you would want to learn what business is under fascism, and you could get it for free, I think, is Vampire Economy by Gunther Reimann. He is a Marxist economist. I think he's democratic socialist. He's not pro-communist either. But he is very accurate, because he lived in Germany in 1946, 1948, before he was caught by the Gestapo with a Chinese nationalist woman. I don't know what she's doing there. What's a Chinese woman doing in Nazi Germany? But he was with her, and then he escaped, and he published his book abroad. And it's a very interesting insight, because it's a primary source, obviously, but it also it shows a little bit more of the quote unquote reality, because he has more conclusions that would contradict modern narratives, if say fascism was the tool of capital interests, of business. And you'll see him say, for example, the regime is obviously, for him, he's saying this regime is state socialist or state capitalist more than anything, and that the business leaders here are obviously suffering. And there's a lot of reactions of the business leaders in Nazi Germany who saw those Nazis, even when they supported them at first, they said, these guys are worse than Bolsheviks. We were going against the Bolsheviks all our lives, and look, the terror is real with the Nazis. And even with August Weissen, everyone, when you mention Nazi industrialists, the people who supported them before 1933, August Weissen is one of the first people you'd listen, you hear. Oh, he's the guy who funded the movement from the beginning. This one guy. Then there's another one, Emil Kildorf, but I think he died in 1928 and fussy. But August Weissen, when Hitler came to power, and he went to talk to Weissen, and Hitler's words are pretty telling. You thought you could buy out my movement and use it like a insurance premium? You're dead wrong. And what Hitler did was, to his old supporter from the mid-1920s, was nationalize his assets and have him live in exile in France. And August Fascism was really, really mad. Like, he called the Nazis like the new Bolsheviks of their time, like the new Bolsheviks of Germany, that Germany was becoming a Bolshevik state. And when the Nazis came through France, he was placed into a concentration camp. And that's where the famous book comes from. I funded the Nazis, because there was a journalist who went to that same concentration camp where Fascism was and wrote the entire interview down and then made the book out of it. And this is explained also in Big Business in the Rise of Adolf Hitler by Henry Turner. It uses both corporate letters and the letters between Nazis from the Nuremberg trials. I really recommend it to look into it deeper. And that's my part of my conclusion. But like, yeah, it's not usually the typical, for me, I would say, the Marxist narrative that it was a tool of capital, but rather with the primary sources and the own people who were involved with it and what the regime did to them. It's a different picture. It was like I said, it was political expediency, and there was a lot of stuff in there.
Yeah, I mean, I think even in that example, we can sort of see the fact, like as you say, it's not a traditional socialist capitalist thing, but when we analyze it, there is still the collusion happening there, right? The use of the state to enable capitalist action and operation seems hypocritical, but in some ways is just an expression of that capitalist sentiment. Now, it's not one that's inclusive. It's not one that enables the freedom of the masses to engage in the market, but it's a more honest expression of it for those those of money already. The business owner you describe had their assets taken off them and nationalized and such, but in a manner that allows the Nazi party and connected individuals to gain capital taken. And it's the same with all the Jewish businesses, because obviously Germany is a big country in Europe. There's a lot of existing stuff there. It's not as though, of course, I feel like it's frustrating when a lot of people describe Jewish people as like there's an anti-Semitic stereotype of them always being really rich and wealthy and such. There's a massive working class Jewish population in anywhere you go, basically, right? But of course, there's also plenty of wealthy Jewish businessmen as well, any ethnic group or religion or whatever. And part of their capitalist organization is taking forcibly the assets of the people they've decried as inhuman and imprisoned and such and killed, and then handing it over to their interested parties. And whilst it seems alien to the ideas of the free market we would typically conjure, in some ways it is a more honest expression of the seizing of capital to further one's own capital. A more direct, not one that people agree with as such, not one that you'd say, yes, this is what we want to have in society, but one that is the expression of capitalists through violence, through the more direct means. And that is where I guess you might call it Marxist, but I would just call it it doesn't necessarily have to be connected to Marx as such. It could be any critical analysis of that system ultimately comes down to a lot of the drive for power that left-wing theory and ideas and sentiment is set up to critique. But my laptop is not to touch, so we'll have to do part 2, where we perhaps turn our gaze from the past to the present and talk about all the current worries and perspectives.
Part 2, I would like to continue this because it's like we with the few in your laptop going on fire, basically. And I would recommend we would continue this part because, of course, like you said, we have to study the now. We have to consider the systems of the past, be it cultural context, the economic context, what happened with the wars, what it meant to the world, what it did, and build up from there, from like 1920s, 1910s, and then we build all the way up to the 60s, the 80s, the end of the Cold War. That's going to be an interesting part. Because there's a lot of interesting stuff about the fall of the Soviet Union. There's a lot of stuff of the fall of the Soviet Union which people like to, online. They like to, they like to talk about, the Soviet Union would have stayed alive if they made this referendum. But then when you look at the people, the August coup, where there's like these hardline Marxist-Leninists they occupy the White House in Russia, and then comes Yeltsin's government forces to kick them out. you see the photos and you have these like this coalition. It was called the National Salvation Front. It was neo-Nazis, monarchists, and Marxist-Leninists together fighting for the non-dissolution of the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, Yeltsin's government is obviously what led to its fall and made the Russian Federation as it is today.
No, it's a fascinating history. We'll definitely have to include it in our discussion. But sadly, my laptop will soon explode.
Yeah, we'll end it here.
It's been quite nice talking to you, Zandrus. Feel free to, if you want, post a comment when the video ends the stream, where you can link some of the sources you mentioned earlier if you'd like. And yes, at some point we'll do our part 2 on the present day and such. Right.
I do warn that it's going to be a very long comment. It's going to be very
long. As long as you'd like, Zandrus. Do we even have a comment limit on YouTube?
Oh, I'll be leaving. All right.
Well, you
have a good day, man.
You will find out. So, right then, take care, everyone.